first speaker is Thomas Killian from Rice.
Thanks a lot. And I want to thank the organizers of the workshop for putting all this together and for inviting me to speak. This is a wonderful opportunity here to learn about some new fields for me and hopefully present some interesting results that you might like too. This is, as you can see, the result of a large collaboration of people, experimental groups all from Rice, my group working with Barry Dunning's group, and with theory support from Hossein Sajibor and Richard Schmidt here at the Harvard-Smithsonian, and Eugene Demler from down the street, but also Shuhai and Joachim from Vienna. So I should also mention that you heard this morning of some work with Jesus Perez-Rios on very similar results from this experiment, but not stuff I'm going to focus on during my talk. So the story that I'm going to tell today starts with the interaction between a Rydberg atom and a ground state atom. So this is the Born-Oppenheimer expression for that potential as a function of the distance between the Rydberg core and the atom. This captures the physics of this electron ground state scattering. So the strength of the potential is proportional to the S-wave scattering length for that interaction and the probability density distribution of the Rydberg electron. So here is a famous picture from the FAU group of the probability distribution for a Rydberg orbital, and where the electron spends a lot of time for a negative scattering length, there's an attractive potential that creates wells in which the ground state atoms can sit. And this can form actually bound molecular states. This is now a well-known famous prediction from Chris Green, Hossein Sajibor from 2000, and then it was seen experimentally in the FAU group from 2009. So this picture, and where a lot of the work started, is really given the description in terms of these molecular states, or few body states, with one, two, or just a few number of atoms bound in these molecular potentials. So here's a plot of to sort of capture that of the number of atoms inside the Rydberg orbital as a function of principal quantum number for a given density that we typically reach in a Bose-Einstein condensate. And so if we take the size of the Rydberg orbital given by the radius to the outer lobe of the wave function, so here's a schematic of that potential of the Rydberg atom interaction. Then we can calculate the number of atoms inside the Rydberg orbital, and it's just the volume of the Rydberg atom times the density. And down at principal quantum numbers on the order of 30 or so, we get 1 or 2 or 3 atoms within the Rydberg orbital. And this is the few body regime. And I'll talk a little bit about this regime to sort of ground our understanding. But where I want to go is up into the many body regime, up at higher quantum numbers, around n equals 70 or 80, where we're up to hundreds of atoms inside the Rydberg orbital. And referring back to the title of my talk, here's where we'll look for signatures of polaronic physics, a real composite quasi-particle formed by the background atoms dressing this Rydberg atom. And really, you can expect this kind of physics to happen because when we excite one atom up to a Rydberg state, it's a tremendous perturbation of the background quantum fluid. That interaction is so strong you get huge perturbations of the density distribution, but then also massive macroscopic occupation of these bound states as shown here. And there are many interesting questions. What's the structure of this composite object that you form? What's the excitation spectrum look like for creating these Rydberg atoms in this dense medium? What's the lifetime of the excitations? And then if we can cast it in the language of the sort of condensed matter Polaron, can we connect it to ideas like the residue and the effective mass of a Polaron? Now, my experiments are not the first ones on these systems. Just a few years ago, in the rubidium system with Tillman Fow's group, they did these experiments exciting a Rydberg atom in the Bose-Einstein condensate as well, very similar to what I do. And here's some results from a very recent paper where this is now the photoexcitation spectrum. So here's detuning away from the atomic resonance as a function of the principal quantum number. And you can see very interesting variations, a lot of structure on here. And then here's the various theory that is explaining this data. So hopefully I'll have some time at the end to really come back and compare to this, but just a few points I want to point out as to why it's interesting there's a lot of open questions still in this system. You can see in the theory here, there's different theories when you include just S-wave scattering between the electron and the Rydberg electron, or include S and P-wave scattering. Really changes the prediction. And the theory, it's in some regime the theory is a good fit, but in other regimes doesn't capture everything. So there's still some room for improved understanding here. And this is rubidium. I would argue that a lot of the complications here come from the fact that there's a P-wave scattering resonance in this system of the electron with the ground state atom. That makes it somewhat complicated to apply your theories to it and to gain intuition from these spectra. So what does the system that I work with bring to the table? So all my experiments are with strontium, ultracold strontium. We study ultracold plasmas. We have straight quantum generator Bose and Fermi gases, and a more recent collaboration with Barry Dunning where we excite Rydberg atoms in Bose-Einstein condensates. But everything uses strontium. And for this experiment, the key thing is that there's no P-wave shape resonance for the scattering of an electron off of a ground state strontium atom. So that really simplifies the potential for that interaction between the Rydberg atom and the ground state atom. And we're going to see that that gives us a much cleaner interpretation to look for signatures of Polaronic physics. So here's the outline of my talk. I'll start by sort of in the molecule picture, the ultra-long-range Rydberg molecule picture, where I talk about what we see in the few-body regime and then the many-body regime, and then switch to the language of Polarons to describe the observations in the many-body regimes and to see if we can see some real clear signatures that tell us something about this object that we'll call the Rydberg Polaron. So my experiment, as I said, we work with strontium. There's strontium-84 is the nice isotope. It's easiest to form a Bose-Einstein condensate. We do it in an optical dipole trap. We can make condensates that are about 75% pure with several 100,000 atoms with peak densities of several times 10 to the 14 per cubic centimeter. And at that density, the typical intraparticle spacing is about 80 nanometers. And in strontium, we excite up to through a two-photon process to the triplet S1 Rydberg levels with N from around 40 to around 70 or so. And we're going to tune this UV laser around resonance to determine our photoexcitation spectrum. So the Rydberg sizes for those principal quantum numbers run from around 100 nanometers for the radius up to close to a micron, so can get up to much larger than the Rydberg size and get us into this many-body regime. For our detection method, we use selective field ionization. So we excite our Rydberg atom, and we really work very hard to keep it to none or one Rydberg excitation per laser shot. So we don't worry about Rydberg excitations. We don't have saturation problems. So we're really in the linear regime for our excitation spectrum. And we detect the excitations by applying an electric field ramp that ionizes the Rydberg atom, directs the electron to the microchannel plate, and with really quite good detection efficiency, we can determine whether we have an excitation or not. Okay, so let's start with the few body regime down at n equals 38 or so here, and here's the potential. Also copied it here. So these potentials are calculated by Shuhei Yoshida at Vienna. And so you can see the potential always has a nice big deep outer lobe, and there are several vibrational levels that are bound within this potential, and the ground vibrational state localizes the ground state atom out in this outer lobe. So that's the most deeply bound state, but you have several excited states as well. And we'll label these nu0, nu1, nu2, nu3. Here's the photoexcitation spectrum. At zero detuning, we have just a bare atomic excitation. So we make a Rydberg atom with no perturbing ground state atoms nearby. But to red detuning, we see clear resonances that reflect one atom bound in this Rydberg electron orbital. So this, typically the most intense transition is for atoms going into this ground state, and then we clearly see atoms going into the excited state. So this is just one atom. So these are dimers. So we'll label them with a D, and the subscript says what state the ground state atom goes into. But that's not all we can see. Obviously, we have more here, and you can see the pattern is repeating. So it's pretty easy to interpret it. So these are now trimers, where it's a Rydberg atom plus two atoms bound in this potential. And this, with this sort of linear with number of atoms shift, here's 2 atoms in the ground state of the vibration. Here's just 1 atom in the ground state. But the pattern, it can get pretty complex pretty quickly. But there's even more down here. So if I blow it up on a log scale, we see everything out from beyond the dimers and the trimers to tetramers, even pentamers, and we can even go further. So quite an elaborate structure here. So the data is the red, and the black line is a theory that I'll come back to in a moment as well. So this is the simple picture in the few body regime of these molecular levels, even up to 4 or 5 atoms. It's still in this nice molecular picture. Now, if you want to do spectroscopy, you can really figure out a lot about this system. We go up in quantum number from 38 to 49, but in a relatively low density sample. This is not a condensate. What happens to the spectrum is it gets compressed. These are the same assignment of the lines in terms of the vibrational levels that are occupied, but it's a big compression of the spectrum. And that just comes about because as the electron orbital gets larger, you only have 1 electron and you're spreading it out, so its local density gets less. So the interaction energy that a ground state atom feels goes down as the volume occupied by the Rydberg electron. So the binding energy goes as 1 over principal quantum number to the 6th. So pretty strong dependence. So you're really compressing these levels. And from the spectroscopy, we can work out that important parameter of that S-wave scattering length between the electron and the ground state atom, which for the most part parameterizes our system. So that's in the few body regime. So what happens when we go to higher quantum number and move up into the many body regime? Okay, so now we're in a condensate. So all this data is pretty much in the same sample. We're not changing the trapped atom sample in which we're doing the excitation. We're just changing the quantum number. And so we have, again, several times 10 to the 14 cubic centimeters peak density. So at n equals 38, even at this high density, we still see very nicely resolved lines. And as we go up to n equals 49, though, you can see that we've had this compression of the spectra by 1 over n to the 6th, but occupation of more deeply bound, many more atoms inside the Rydberg orbital. Here we're at just a few. Here we're up to around 15 or so. I guess that's shown over here. That's about 15 atoms inside the orbital. And we're seeing this broad continuum now going out to much further red detuning. We go up even further to n equals 60. So now we're about 50 atoms inside the Rydberg orbital. And there's no resolved states, just this broad continuum. It's changing a little bit as well. I guess I should point out that at 0 detuning, this is the pure atomic excitation. That's coming from the thermal atoms that are not in the condensate. We have about 25% non-condensed atoms, and that gives us a contribution here at 0 detuning. Now finally go up to n equals 72. We're up at about 200 atoms per Rydberg orbital. Again, just total continuum. The shape has changed a little bit, but it seems like we're going to some sort of a limit as we go up in higher quantum number. So you could look at this and say, well, it's not that big of a surprise. Okay, you're just not resolving the levels anymore because the level spacing is going down so much. As n goes up, 1 over n to the 6th gets really small. But that's really not all that's going on here. That explains why we see a continuum, perhaps, rather than resolved levels, but still the shape of this spectrum, the extent of it, isn't explained by that simple scaling model. So there's a lot here that's going on beyond just the fact that we're not resolving individual transitions anymore. So how can we understand this shape of this spectrum? The simplest way to get at it is to just make a mean field approximation. I don't have time in the talk to really go through too much in this derivation, but the basic ideas were sketched out by the FAL group. And the idea is basically that when you excite a Rydberg atom at a given place in the condensate, it's at a given local density there, and the density of atoms that are inside that Rydberg orbital determine an interaction energy for that Rydberg sort of ground state atom collection, and that shifts the Rydberg excitation. So that shift should be proportional to the density, which is telling you how many atoms are in the Rydberg orbital, and that S-wave scattering length. So it's kind of switching the paradigm to thinking about the shift that one ground state atom sees in a Rydberg orbital to thinking about the potential energy that one Rydberg atom sees in a sea of all the ground state atoms. Okay? So it's the same interaction. So that's where one Rydberg excitation, what the energy shift would be for a given density. So a low density would contribute here, a high density would contribute out here at a larger shift. And to figure out the spectrum, you just integrate that shift over the density distribution, which tells you what the signal intensity will be at each relative shift. And we have a Thomas Fermi density distribution that we know quite well, and it gives us this relatively well-known shape here shown in the black line. Again, this is the thermal atoms that you could include them in the simulation relatively easily, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. And it clearly works pretty well. So we know the peak density very well to determine it independently. So without any real adjustable parameters, we can get a pretty nice fit. But there's clear deviations there. But this gives us a decent idea about what's going on. And most of this shape of the spectra is just coming about because of the inhomogeneous density distribution in our condensate. So let's look at what the spectrum does across quantum numbers and how compared against our mean field simulation. So here's the n equals 49 data. That doesn't, you can still see some of the resolved molecular lines showing up here. It kind of gets a shape, but not too well. But as you go up to n equals 60, it gets quite a bit better. N equals 72, it's actually doing a pretty good job. Just a little bit missing this tail. And so the mean field is clearly capturing it and getting better as we go to higher quantum number. So the mean field has helped us see that it's the inhomogeneous density distribution that gives a lot of this, except for some of the deviations, especially in the tail. But the mean field also gives us a way to look at the spectra in a universal kind of way. I'm going to rescale the frequency axis according to the mean field prediction for the peak shift. So I know the density very well in my condensate. I know this scattering length well. So from the peak density and the scattering length, I can get a peak shift, and that's where the mean field prediction ends. And so if I scale the frequency in each case by that peak shift, then all the data should collapse on a universal curve. Now we only have one mean field prediction, because in scaled units it's a universal prediction. And the experimental data all actually does look reasonably well in terms of collapsing onto a curve. The lower quantum number seems to deviate the most. As you go to n equals 60 or n equals 72, it gets better, closer to the universal mean field prediction. But still some deviations there. So, the mean field's nice, but mean field isn't always that interesting. We want to look beyond mean field effects. And it's this tail where these beyond mean field effects are really showing up well and actually will give us the cleanest signature of some interesting physics. To highlight that, let's put the signal on a log linear scale. So same data. And that helps us see this tail. We have good signal noise, so we can really look at this tail over a good order of magnitude and signal strength. Just to highlight what's happening there, I'll put some lines on it. There's clearly deviations that have very systematic things happening with principal quantum number. And the densities all pretty close to each other. The sample's a good Thomas Fermi, Bose-Einstein condensate. So really the sample's pretty much the same. It's just the quantum number we're exciting to. But we're seeing this deviation in the tail. The tail reaches out further with a lower slope for the lower quantum number, and as we go to n equals 60 and 72, it's getting steeper. So here is where I claim we'll look for some interesting many-body effects and for signatures of something that we can call a Rydberg Polaron. Now, in order to really talk about this and explain this, we have to change our picture a little bit. So this picture of molecules and even the mean field shift isn't really going to give us the intuition that we want. So now we'll switch to describing it in terms of polarons. And for this work, I really relied a lot on my theory collaborators. Richard Schmidt in the audience has been working on this problem for several years, developing the kind of theoretical machinery and the picture to use to describe this. But the basic idea is that this Rydberg excitation, you want to think of it as an impurity in a quantum gas. And it has a huge interaction with the background bosonic fluid, which perturbs that distribution of bosons, shown schematically here from some other impurity physics papers. And in the limit of many, many atoms per Rydberg orbital, the bosonic excitations of the BEC dress that impurity to form something that we'll call the Rydberg Polaron, and try to convince you that it forms a nice quasi-particle. Now, these concepts of polarons obviously go back to many, many years, to the middle of the last century, originally developed in the condensed matter context for the composite object of an electron in a solid dressed by the phonons of the lattice as it moves through the lattice. But that idea has been extended by many, many people over many years to a zoo of polarons in all kinds of environments, even in liquids, not just in solids as well. So there's a lot of, kind of a bewildering amount of literature here, but also a lot of very well-developed formalism. And most interestingly, in very recent years, this idea has been applied very powerfully to describe objects now considered polarons in ultracold Fermi gases and Bose gases. These are bosons for contact interactions between atoms in different hyperfine states than the background gases. Actually, these experiments are very similar to the experiments that I'm doing, where you start with an atom in a non-interacting state and excite it to an interacting state and look at the excitation spectrum of how to create that strongly interacting impurity. So here's a basic Hamiltonian that can describe this problem in second quantized notation. It really should work for any of these systems. I'm neglecting the kinetic energy of the polaron itself, so we're assuming a massive polaron, but that's actually not so critical for what we do, but that now we can relax that assumption, but we'll keep it simple here. So we have the kinetic energy of the background bosons. We can have the boson-boson interactions, and then here is the term for the interactions between the single impurity and the bosonic background gas. So we destroy bosons momentum K, create them with a different momentum, and this operator will enforce that you only get the interactions when the impurity is in the strongly interacting state, for example. So only when we actually put it in the Rydberg state. So the strength of this interaction is proportional to the Fourier transform of the spatial representation of the impurity background gas interaction. So in our case, for the Rydberg polaron, that's that potential in terms of the S-wave scattering length and the square of the Rydberg orbital. So a lot of interesting structure there to give us some real different spatial features in momentum space for this interaction. So here are the interaction terms. Now this Rydberg background state interaction is so strong that the Bose-Bose interactions are actually not going to be important. So you can put them in or not put them in, but it doesn't matter. You don't need them to be thinking about them to understand the concept of this polaron. So this Hamiltonian you make different kinds of assumptions. You can describe polarons in different regimes. A typical assumption is you make the Bogolua approximation, and you end up keeping just terms linear in these field operators, and you get the Froelich Polaron Hamiltonians, or the most common form. For our Rydberg Polaron Hamiltonians, we'll have to keep terms bilinear in these operators to describe especially the bound states that we form. So it is a very much more strongly interacting object than some of the standard, more common condensed matter polarons. So this theory, I can take no credit for it whatsoever. But the basics was solving this Hamiltonian was in a really nice paper here from about a year ago by Richard Schmidt, Hossein Sajpour, and Eugene Demler. And basically, the excitation spectrum could be reduced to a Fourier transform of this expectation value of this interesting time evolution operator. At t equals 0, this could be reduced to just the sort of an overlap between a time evolved BEC with this interacting Hamiltonian and with just the unperturbed Hamiltonian. And some functional determinant theory was used to evaluate these expectation values and take these Fourier transforms. And the theory, it's amazing how well this theory works. So with very, very few parameters, essentially just tweaking that S-wave scattering length to match the binding of these molecular levels in the few body regime. Those same parameters, without having to tweak them, can explain the few body regime, the intermediate regime, where you've got now this continuum tail, and also these resolved molecular lines all the way into the continuum line. You just put in our laser line width, but that's actually not so critical on this for this broad line. But there's not an additional parameter to set sort of the relative intensities of these lines. The relative intensity of this comes out from the intrinsic theory, and you can put in the density distribution of the cloud and the temperature of the atoms, and even fit the thermal fraction as well. But it's all self-consistent, and we can independently measure all the experimental parameters, and the fits are amazingly good. So you really can trust this theory, which is a great great guide for us. So, in terms of getting a lot of intuition out of that theory, we'll talk a little bit more about it. But the most valuable thing that I'll use it here for is to help us interpret this tail and see if we can pull out of this tail some signatures that tell us something interesting and unique about the Rydberg Polaron. So one of the things that we have to get around is we have to get around the fact that this is an inhomogeneous density distribution. I said that the bulk of this spectrum is given by that density distribution. That's not the interesting physics. I'd like to get the intrinsic excitation spectrum of the Rydberg Polaron. And you could imagine exciting a uniform density region with crossing your lasers very carefully, but we're illuminating the whole condensate. So that's the data that we have. But we can use the theory to separate the contribution from a central region at high density from other regions. And that will turn out to be very powerful. So we can use the theory to calculate this spectral function and look at the contributions from the different densities. And here, that's what we have here. So the whole fit is this solid line. The contribution from a central region, which only has a few percent deviation in density, so relatively uniform density, that gives this Gaussian here. Okay? And the rest of the condensate contributes this. So the tail comes entirely from this relatively uniform density region. So by looking at the tail, we can get around the density and homogeneity. So that's why we focus on the tail. And obviously it fits really well. Here's that analysis done on several different quantum numbers. So here goes n equals 49, the decomposition into the central region. Again, the tail comes just from the central high density region. Go a little higher quantum number against the tail is really coming from the high density region. To help see what's going on, now let's go to the scaled frequency units in terms of our mean field theory. And so here's the mean field prediction. Here's our data. I've switched it to continue going red detuning. Sorry, I switched that on you. So lower quantum number, the slope is lower. As the quantum number increases, you get a steeper slope. Or in terms of the predictions from the functional determinant theory, at high quantum number, we get a narrow distribution from that central region. Lower the quantum number, a little broader for n equals 60, n equals 49, quite broad. Again, we haven't changed the density distribution. It's just changing the Rydberg object, just changing the impurity. So this is showing us that the intrinsic excitation spectrum for a relatively uniform density region for this Rydberg Polaron object depends strongly on the quantum number. The other characteristics that I'll emphasize is the shape is very close to Gaussian. And as I said, the width is increasing as the principal quantum number decreases. Other thing that's interesting is that it extends quite far past the peak mean field prediction. So these are all the things that we'd like to be able to explain. So we'll try to use the density, the functional determinant theory again to explain it. This is another way to sort of massage the theoretical prediction for the spectrum. This is sort of in terms of a Fermi's golden rule prediction for the spectrum, where we basically have our initial state. This is the condensate with the impurity in the non-interacting state. Here's our laser that excites the Rydberg atom. It essentially just flips it from the non-interacting to the strongly interacting impurity state. Doesn't really act on the overall wave function of the condensate. But you have, so here's the BEC, and then you have this state, which is the many-body state of all the atoms in the background gas, but now in the presence of this very strongly perturbing potential. And you sum over all the possible final states of all the different configurations of atoms in this potential in the presence of this interaction. So it's the eigenstates of the interacting Hamiltonian. And those are the final states that with this Fermi's golden rule gives you an excitation spectrum. So you can imagine doing this. I wouldn't want to do it myself, but I'm glad Richard will do it. And that's what gives you this fit. So all these different configurations are just all the different ways of putting atoms into these states. So in the few body regime, it's pretty easy to get a handle of it. It's 3 atoms in this state, 1 atom in here, and 2 atoms in here. But in the many body state, this quickly gets very complicated as I find all the different ways to put 200 atoms in this state. So that's a much more complicated object. But from that intuition, we can go back to the many body regime. So n equals, this is probably n equals 72 with a couple hundred atoms here. And what we can say is in this width of this spectrum is essentially giving us the spread of energies that have of final states, final configurations of atoms in this Rydberg Polaron state. So larger detuning has a lot more atoms in more deeply bound states. The less detuning is exciting to a state where there were, just due to fluctuations, there were relatively fewer atoms projected into that Rydberg orbital with the interactions. So the distribution of final states reflects sort of the fluctuations in the state that you project onto with those overlap integrals. It's like some big, huge many-body Frank-Condon factor. So that gives the general idea of what the shape is, but can we get more particular? Can we explain a Gaussian? Can we explain the behavior in the width? So let's think about the Gaussian first. Why might it be a Gaussian shape? Well, so we have this expression in terms of a sum over all these possible configurations. It turns out that you can actually break this up into a sum over products of single particle overlap integrals. So this is the one particle in the single mode BC, and then beta 0 is the most deeply bound state in the Rydberg potential. Beta 1 is the next excited state in the Rydberg potential, and so on and so on. So you get this product of all these overlap integrals that basically are telling you what's the probability of projecting an atom from the condensate wave function into each of these different states. Well, this kind of expression, it's basically telling you it's kind of a stochastic process as you're projecting atoms into these wave functions. And it's kind of reminiscent of like a binomial distribution if you only had two states that you were projecting into, maybe one bound in the Rydberg orbital and one not. Then you would only have one state here, and it would look exactly like this binomial type expansion. And in the limit of many, many atoms, with very small probability of actually being in the state, the binomial distribution will go over to a Gaussian. That's well known. That's essentially what's happening here. It's just so maybe a central limit theorem kind of an argument that lots of stochastic processes, you're going to get a Gaussian thing here. So that's the overall Gaussian shape. What about the width? How do we get that? Well, so you have this overlap integral, and then it contributes at the frequency which you have energy conservation. And so that contribution, essentially, the energy is essentially proportional to how many atoms are in that Rydberg orbital. That gives you the density inside the orbital, and that gives you the shift. So again, it's a stochastic process. With a BEC, we have Poissonian number fluctuations for how many atoms we expect to project in there. So we expect that there to be a fluctuation in the density for any particular realization of this quantum measurement. So the fluctuation in the energy should go as the fluctuations in the density. That fluctuation should go as fluctuation in the number divided by the volume of the Rydberg orbital. Fluctuations goes as square root of number. So if you sort of plug in square root of the number of atoms in the Rydberg orbital, you end up with a square root of density over principal quantum number cubed dependence for the fluctuations. So we expect the width to go down as principal quantum number cubed. And so that explains as the quantum number goes up, the line gets, the excitation spectrum gets narrower and narrower. And from it's probably cleanest to see it from the simulations, but here's the width of this uniform region as a function of principal quantum number, and it follows the 1/n cubed scaling very well. So this intuitive explanation for what's going on there works quite well. Okay, so I just have another minute or two, so I just wanted to come back to the rubidium observations. Jesus was one of the theorists who did some of this work describing this spectrum with the S wave and the P wave scattering. And what's the difference here? These shapes are clearly different. They're similar, but they're definitely different than the strontium spectrum. And so what's different, as I mentioned, it doesn't come about on this simple description of the potential. You have to add more terms into the potential that a ground state atom sees. You have to add the P wave, the term for the P wave electron atom scattering. You could even add the ion atom polarization potential, but that's not so important for us. And so that P wave scattering length goes through a resonance in rubidium goes through a resonance in cesium. I'll skip over this and assume you know about the shape resonances. But that P-wave resonance in rubidium changes the potential from the simple blue one, which looks a lot like strontium, to this red one, where you get huge energies for when an atom happens to fall in certain regions. So these fits come from classical Monte Carlo fits, where you just put atoms down randomly, sample the energy distribution, and do it all again, roll the dice, and average it over, and you get these kind of distributions. And the shape is very, very sensitive to how many atoms happen to fall in this particular place of the potential. So, it's really interesting physics, but it's very particular to this kind of resonance structure, not really looking at what we were focusing on, which is the really intrinsic excitation spectrum for the Rydberg impurity, which, because in strontium we don't have that P-wave shape resonance, makes it a lot easier for us to interpret this spectrum, and we can see these nice Gaussians and see the 1/n³ dependence. So I think strontium really brought us a lot in its experiments to get at the physics of what what we're now calling this Rydberg Polaron, this impurity dressed by all the excitations in the background. I'm just about out of time, so I should stop, but there's a lot of interesting questions. It's kind of an interesting Polaron compared to other condensed matter systems because it's such a massive perturbation of density distribution, and it involves very deeply bound many molecular states. That's unusual. Usually a traditional condensed matter Polaron is just dressed by density sound waves of the background medium, not so many bound states. So there's a lot. This is just a start for us. Strontium is a great system in which to work on this. Right now we're working really hard to do this in fermions with 87 strontium. And we'll go to a quantum regenerate single species or single state Fermi gas and look at these experiments again. We really should see a significant difference in the spectrum for bosons versus fermions, which I think would be very, very interesting. But then we'd like to continue our understanding of this Rydberg Polaron object, and especially trying to connect to the condensed matter concepts and see if we can think about whether there's self-localization of this Polaron, if effective mass is something we can think about or perhaps measure. And of course, there are other interesting things like the lifetime of these states, which I think you heard about this morning. The lifetimes make it challenging to do some of these experiments. The Rydberg atoms don't live long. And then even we can think about interactions between these Rydberg Polaron states. There's a lot we can do. So for me, I think it's really, really fascinating that now we've really brought together these two fields that were both kind of started in the 30s, where Enrico Fermi and Segre and Amaldi were looking at dense Rydberg gases, and these theorists were looking at polarons and condensed matter systems, and now our experiments bring these two fields together, somewhat 80 years later. So I will close by thanking the graduate students who worked on the experiments, Barry Dunning, and all our wonderful theory collaborators, and I'll thank you for your attention.